So now I call on John Statakis to lead the next panel on strategic decision-making and political turmoil.
Yeah, so sit at the end. So why don't we switch Eric and Nina?
Perfect. Thank you. Both are fine.
Okay. Oops. Okay, good afternoon. So we heard some political thoughts this morning from Thomas Joyce, who sort of scared the pants off of some of us. And it's hard not to have a bit of whiplash from all the political turmoil twirling around us these days. Barely a month ago, commentators were heralding the beginning of World War III because the U.S. took out an Iranian general. And that's after a couple of years of superpower standoff over trade and tariffs that has redirected a lot of ship traffic. And today we find that the U.S. has trouble holding an election in Iowa. So there's a lot of turmoil going on. We've also seen an uptick in piracy, particularly in West Africa. That has alarmed many ship owners, not to mention the P&I clubs, as we heard just now. And the oil flow from traditional superpowers like Iran and Venezuela has been affected as well. Sanctions has been a huge subject as well, as we heard this morning, and we'll hear a little bit more about that as well. So to navigate these waters, we've asked a few of our industry observers to speak on these topics. Irina Nosova is Director of Sanctions and Compliance for the Liberian Ship Registry. She's also a lawyer and serves as the custodial officer for the Lisker Trust Company. So those with bearer shares, keep that in mind still. Don't tell Mike about that, though. Mike Weber is well known to many of us as the senior equity analyst covering shipping for Wells Fargo for many years and the creator of a corporate governance scorecard. Michael, you'll be glad to know about that. We'll talk about that later. Last year, he founded Weber Research and Advisory, where he continues to cover the shipping world and also provides consulting and other services. Tom Sheehy is the founder of the consulting firm Quinella Global. Before that, he served as staff director to the House Foreign Affairs Committee for 6 years as an aide to Congressman Ed Royce. And that's still regarded as the most bipartisan committee in Congress, I think. There is such a thing, apparently. Before going to Capitol Hill, Tom co-developed the Index of Economic Freedom, which conducts an annual survey of national economies. And lastly, Eric Stern is professor of political science at the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity of SUNY Albany, and has a particular interest in maritime safety and security. And he's also the author of The Politics of Crisis Management, Public Leadership Under Pressure. And with that, I'd like to ask Eric to give us sort of an academic overview of the subject we're going to discuss, and then we'll jump into questions and discussion.
Okay, and is the PowerPoint available? If it's not a problem. I can.
Yes, that's a good question. There's your clicker.
Perfect.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be a part of this event. I've found it very instructive to listen to some of the challenges that the industry is facing, and really have been impressed with the diversity and expertise in the room from so many perspectives. I'm going to start by being a little bit inspired by George Simas, and I'm going to add a subtitle to my presentation based on our previous discussion of the edge cases. So I'm going to add the subtitle, living on the edge. And I'm Smith there, for those of you who may not be pop music fans. We're living in a time where there's a great deal of turbulence. Some of that turbulence is biological, like the coronavirus that a number of us have mentioned today. And that biological turbulence becomes amplified or in some cases mitigated by the political and administrative reactions to it, the psychological reactions to it. And so, let me see here. Next slide. I don't know who's. Green button. Perfect. I just want to identify a number of different types of cases that either originate in the political realm or have been greatly complicated for industry and for others by the political reactions, political dynamics that are unleashed. I could have also focused on cases like the Costa Concordia, which was mentioned earlier today, or Exxon Valdez, where human error or negligence on the part of a captain under the influence creates a huge problem that spills over to the public sector, but of course, responsible companies and industry actors need to deal with those consequences as well. Those cases are very difficult. On this slide, I'm just touching on the NotPetya, which was also mentioned before, that demonstrated the interconnectedness and the vulnerability of a company like Maersk, and led to very concrete backups at not only were business systems and all types of control systems knocked out throughout their vast multinational corporate network, but also big pileups of containers at port facilities. Mentioned the coronavirus. The Maersk, Alabama case was kind of interesting. Maersk is coming up a lot in this presentation. I guess they're not here, so maybe that's good. That was a case where business as usual had emerged in dealing with modern piracy, as I understand it, largely seen in the industry and by insurance actors as kind of a cost of doing business. It was predictable. People weren't getting hurt. And all of a sudden, an American flagged vessel gets involved for the first time, and the Obama administration decides to send a very loud signal that this will not be tolerated. And you had a case where it was resolved by Navy SEALs, and a lot of different dynamics were set in motion, and the parameters for dealing with the problem shifted significantly after that, as I understand it. Many of these cases and others that I will mention briefly demonstrate a kind of a frame-breaking character. You're used to dealing with an issue a certain way. News case comes along that in one way or another violates the assumptions, the paradigm, and then requires thinking outside of the box. And these cases are highly sensitive. The organizations that are involved, be they public sector, private sector, nonprofit, or combinations thereof, are subjected to very intense scrutiny. Some of these originate in the political space, and just some of these events, a quick list ranging from the fall of the Berlin Wall, Brexit, trade wars. Many of these have been mentioned as challenging. Spin-offs and cascades from these events challenge the ability of leaders and their organizations to adapt. So this really speaks to, I think, a fundamental theme of the conference, which is about adaptation. In the rest of my talk, and I'll be brief, I'm just drawing from my book, The Politics of Crisis Management, which John was kind enough to mention. The book takes a kind of before, during, and after perspective on crisis management, but our topic is decision making, so I'm just going to focus on that in relation to political turmoil. Political turmoil is not a scientific term. If you look it up, there are not a ton of journal articles, but I think if we unpack it just a little, what we find is that these are situations that are characterized by increased levels of uncertainty, unpredictability, creating unanticipated situations for actors. Now, why do we care? It's because they impact things that are very important to us. So there are potential threats to core values, And those values may be humanitarian, they may be financial, they may be political, they may be social. And we find often that there are trade-offs, say in a security situation between efficiency and speed of flows and increasing security to deal with the heightened threat environment that has been revealed in the situation. These are situationally dynamic. There's time pressure to act, and if you fail to do so, there may be windows of opportunity to affect events in a positive way that disappear. So that you need to be alert, you need to be agile. These are exactly the conditions that in the literature are associated with the notion of crisis. And in a crisis, people are forced to make the most important decisions, often that arise in public life, under the worst possible conditions. And so they pose severe challenges of adaptive leadership and strategic decision making. So I just want to conclude with a couple of top tips to think about if you're part of an organization that, like Maersk was in a couple of the examples that I already mentioned, is struck by a crisis that probably will come out of left field, and so your planning and your organization and your prior training may not equip you to deal with the situation. In fact, often it may even become an obstacle if you adhere rigidly to scripts that don't fit what you're seeing. So first of all, you want to avoid tunnel vision, and you want to identify the full range of values and stakeholders that are implicated by the situation. You want to combine head and heart. I'm going to pick on poor Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, who was observing the corona crisis and was quoted all over the media as saying that, yeah, in the end, this is bad, but at the end of the day, this is probably going to be good for America. Well, that was something that was perhaps perceived as containing some kind of a cool financial calculation, but not a whole lot of heart. And good crisis leadership requires both of those things. You want to have a diversity of view and expertise. And again, I'm very happy to see that gathered in this room if you're dealing with a crisis problem. If you have people who are too alike, people who are not independent enough in their thinking, people can succumb to groupthink and latch on to a premature representation of the problem, or latch on to a course of action that's ineffective or unethical. So what you want to do is bring together generalists and specialists, legal, a lot of lawyers in the room, financial, crisis communication. Even if you do something that really is the right thing to do, if you can't explain it, you can't make people understand, it's going to hit your brand and your reputation. So you have to manage the incident itself. You have to manage people's understanding of it. Subject matter experts, that varies from case to case. Now medical is key for corona. You want to be proactive. The one thing you can never get back in a crisis is time. You need to take advantage of those windows of opportunity. Often you do that by identifying multiple trajectories, multiple scenarios. Sometimes if adversaries are involved, red teaming. UAlbany has just started a new Center for Advanced Red Teaming that is working across public, private, and nonprofit sector organizations. Put in a plug there for my colleagues. That may be something that you want to discuss at some point. Finally, these events can be extremely stressful. Often we have the notion that a crisis is something that is very short-lived, and that if you just drink a lot of coffee, you'll get through it. Some of these incidents drag out for days, weeks, months, even years with chronic peaks. And so you need to create a crisis organization that is sustainable and that takes care of the human capital that has to engage. And I'm going to stop there. I could talk a lot more about it. It's my favorite subject, and you guys are a wonderful group. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. That's kind of triggered in my mind a question for Mike. We discussed and heard quite a bit earlier about ESG, and you created a scorecard on G, governance. And I wonder if you have noted examples of dealing with these kinds of crises or political issues and a difference between well-governed versus non-well-governed companies in your experience.
Not in my experience, not to date at a company-specific level. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And a lot of times I think it happens and we might not see it in the public markets. But as it pertains to ESG specifically and how they would deal with some sort of geopolitical shock,
Like who's the number one rated in your scorecard?
Actually, I can't remember. Ardmore's probably up there.
Ardmore, yeah.
Usually it's
Okay.
some of the newer, the re-emerged companies, yeah.
They haven't had to deal with something like that yet, maybe.
No, but obviously there was the front, Alistair Steer was on fire on the cover of the Wall Street Journal over the summer.
Right.
And I thought Robert and Frontline handled that particularly well. I don't know that it necessarily translates to data that that someone like me would be able to parse out of a filing and try to lay down a framework on. It's maybe a second or third iteration
Okay.
in terms of a diversity of views and response management, things like that.
Okay. Irina, let me jump to you. Sanctions has been a huge issue for the last couple of years. We heard a little bit about it this morning. Last year, the U.S. sanctioned a division of Costco, and they had chartered a number of large vessels around the world, and these owners were stuck with a sanctioned charterer suddenly out of the blue. And I understand the sanctions were just lifted last week. But what practical effects do sanctions have on the flag state, and do the sanctions change? Have these increased sanctions affected how you guys do your work and oversee your fleet?
Thank you, John. I wish I could say that flag registries are immune from sanctions, but obviously that's not the case. And Matt Thomas had very well said it in the earlier panel that shipping is a vector to achieve geopolitical aim, and all industry players, including the flag registries, are obviously affected by it. Now, how does our daily life within a flag registry or flag administration gets affected by sanctions? We like to see ourselves not an enforcer of sanctions, despite the enormous push from the State Department and OFAC. We are, first and foremost, an international corporate and shipping service provider that falls under auspices of a government of a separate country. However, as the national authority, we need to operate, and every flag state registry needs to operate within the international legal norms that specific country is party to, and national legislation. We have found it to be the case that every sanctioned vessel, in addition to being guilty of a sanctionable illicit activity, has in some form or fashion violated other international norms and conventions. And that is the first and foremost trigger for a flag registry to take certain actions towards or in relation to that specific vessel. What does it mean for our, what does it mean for our daily operations? We must stay on top of all these sanctions development, because we know that the only way to learn about sanctioned vessels is checking the OFAC website or sometimes media outlets, so we do that. We also, again, as a flag registry, as a service provider, we cannot control our customers, our clients, and tell them how to do their business. But as Gina correctly noted, we can provide them with means to make a choice, whether to engage in a sanctionable activity with all the risks that it entails, or try and stay on the compliance side. So we do a lot of work in trying to keep our clients best informed of all sanctions developments. And as again mentioned in the previous panels, sanctions are a very complicated and legal field. What we do for our clients is translate the legalese into the words that ship owners, corporate owners would understand. And these are just few examples of what we do on a daily basis.
Sure, thank you. Thank you. You could see from, I think it was Bill Nugent on the last panel, was sort of terrified by the idea of pirate attack, and this has happened to a number of companies that many of us are involved with. So I'd like to go to Tom, because you've spent many years working on U.S.-Africa policy, and for us in shipping, piracy sort of equates with Africa. And sadly, it seems like it's become a thing again, in particular now in West Africa as well. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on dealing with that.
Sure. Thanks, John. And Obviously, the Gulf of Guinea is a real problem area. Recently, I had the opportunity to travel to Djibouti and talk to a few people about the relative success we had in combating Somali piracy going back. And there were several factors that went into that. We had a massive international commitment to combating piracy. We had the Chinese involved, the U.S., Brits, France, Italy. And so there was a strong agreement on the need to combat piracy. There was a willingness to pay for it. In 2013, it cost $3 billion estimated to have the fleets out there to deter the pirates. It also required a UN agreement which gave the international community special judicial authority to operate in Somalia. The shipping companies armed some of the ships, and I know that can be somewhat of a controversial policy, but that was adopted. And we had relative stability in Somalia. We had, with the UN force in Somalia, there was some semblance of security brought about. There was a semi-independent Somaliland, which did a better job at policing its shorelines. And lastly, as someone told me, we had a few demonstration projects. So we had a few Russians who were particularly brutal with pirates and would put them on small skiffs and send them out to sea if they were lucky. So there was a certain brutality towards combating the pirates. So it was a complicated, complex, global response to piracy, and it's still a problem. It can always flare up, and Somalia is somewhat insecure, and so that could always come back. My concern looking to the West Africa is you don't have those elements coming together to combat that. You don't have an international consensus. You don't have the cooperation. You don't have a financial commitment. You have very unstable states. Most of the pirates come from Nigeria. Nigeria is not moving in the right direction. You've had international crime and chaos in the deltas, delta region of Nigeria for years. That's not getting better. So it's a major concern. Frankly, I don't see the U.S. having the kind of commitment to West Africa that would be required. In fact, we're talking about pulling back our several thousand troops in AFRICOMMAND out of the Sahel region of Africa. And so I hate to bring bad news, but I just don't see the elements coming together for the kind of effective and frankly very impressive effort we had to combat the Somali pirates.
It seems like piracy is a situation where you need good public-private partnership, and I'd like to kind of pivot over to Eric on that issue. Do you see any examples where that could work in the political turmoil world?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think there's a recognition almost across the board, and I'm an all hazards guy, so as my presentation indicated. But when you're dealing with the types of challenging, wicked problems that we're talking here, you're almost always going to need public-private, nonprofit partnership. We were talking cyber before. I know there are efforts underway to create or to reinvigorate the HACC-NACC, the Information Sharing and Analysis Center for maritime, as this problem has become more important. I know there are efforts underway around the ports as well. There are others here who can speak to that more effectively than I can. It's very difficult. Actually, Joe, would you mind standing up? This is Joe Rizzo from the Global Maritime Coordination Center. We did a project with some of my students where we were looking at models for in collaboration with GMCC, looking at how one might be able to improve the flow of information between public and private sector agencies. So please have a word with Joe about that. I know that there's an interest, and there of course are different types of obstacles that don't always make it easy for the government to spread classified information or for corporate entities to spread proprietary information.
Thanks. So the Middle East has always been a center of turmoil, at least as far as I could remember. So Iran and the sanctions against them continue to be a big factor affecting shipping. Venezuela now, in the last few years, sadly, sort of deteriorated. I wonder, Mike, if you have some thoughts on the tanker market and how that's dealing with that turmoil.
from a market's perspective, I think in general sanctions are generally easier for the market to price in over a long term than geopolitical risk. Before I came over here today, I was actually in the process of working on something around the Chinese potentially declaring force majeure on some LNG FOB cargoes because of the coronavirus. And I was going back to my notes, and I realized I'd actually asked Cheniere a bunch of the same questions this time a year ago, and it was when Pakistan and India were shooting down each other's fighter jets, and we thought, okay, here we go. We haven't seen this before. We're going to see big geopolitical risk premium get priced into crude and into tanker names, and it kind of came and went overnight, and nobody really batted an eye, at least in our world. It seems, from our perspective, that the second derivative change associated with geopolitical risk is getting gradually narrower. That's not a perfect data series. Certainly, when you see a state-sponsored attack and a state-sponsored retaliation like we saw in Iran, that's going to be an outlier. You're going to get a move in crude volatility and in the underlying commodity. But by and large, it's much more difficult to predict, what impacts on a risk premium that, what sort of geopolitical risk premium gets priced in with any given event. And if anything, they have unfortunately probably underperformed relative to what we in the market would have expected over time. That it's kind of narrowing a bit. Yeah.
All right. Now, Rita, you kind of touched on this a little when we were discussing earlier about sanctions. Do you find that the governments are looking to the flag state more and more for enforcement to keep your ships out of these places?
While I would like to say that that's not the case, eventually, yes, the powers to enforce sanctions through different mechanisms, such as international laws and conventions, are in the hands of the flag registries. But something I would like to mention that goes to what Eric was saying about how important is the exchange of information between not only private and public partnerships, but also in the field and subject of sanctions in general. You or some of you may know that in one of the advisories, OFAC had come up with a suggestion for flag registries to publish information on vessels that are delisted due to sanctionable activities. So we have actually taken it further, and last year in August, the three major flag states, being Liberia, Marshall Islands, and Panama, have entered into a memorandum of understanding agreeing to exchange information on vessels that have engaged in sanctionable activity or are being investigated for such activity between each other. So now every time we or our counterparties are in the process of investigating a vessel, or deregistering a vessel, denying the registration, we share that information. So again, this is something that may be interesting to other players in the industry, perhaps class societies or P&Is, but that goes to the point of how important it is to talk between each other.
Tom, I'd like to ask, as we're starting to run out of time, but the trade deal with China, the U.S. and China, they've been sort of trying to work something out, supposedly. I've heard descriptions of this phase one ranging from the greatest deal in the history of deals to a nothing burger. So what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. If I could just add just real quick on sanctions, because I worked on Capitol Hill for over 20 years and wrote a lot of sanctions bills, and it's become a very popular means of foreign policy, and part of the problem is typically there's given very little thought to what the end game is. And so, for example, on Iran, we've got a policy of maximum pressure, and so we're loading up on sectoral sanctions, but really we don't have the diplomatic apparatus or the end game in sight. And we all want an Iran without a nuclear weapon, but we've pretty much given up on the diplomatic side of it. And so now we just have the maximum pressure campaign. And so just my experience is there's very little resistance to sanctions. A politician comes up, it's a very easy thing. It sounds like you're doing something. And unfortunately, there's, sometimes sanctions are a good thing. They can help the situation. Other times they can't. They hurt. The quality of debate, political debate, has to be a lot better on sanctions. Just real quick on the China deal, I'm pretty pessimistic about the phase two, the more systemic reforms of the Chinese economy, bringing about change, which supposedly is a year or two down the road. What I've observed is a real element of populism in the U.S., in the Congress, which is going to have an effect on our trade policy. I think, unfortunately, Congress has pretty much given up on directing trade policy over the last 10 years. The administration is very much empowered to use tariffs now, and I think has a vision of the global economy, which is not the traditional, certainly not the traditional Republican economy. It's a much of a unilateral approach. I think the whole evolution of 5G, the whole tech bifurcation of the global economy is, we're seeing more and more of that. In fact, in the Wall Street Journal today, they report on the U.S. now working with the major U.S. tech companies to develop an alternative to Huawei, which sounds a lot like industrial policy. And so things are moving very quickly, and I don't think it's going to have a positive impact on increased trade flows. The trade flows will change, do a lot of work on BRI and looking at China, looking at Africa and other areas, but the future of U.S.-China trade is not, we can't assume it's going to continue on an upward trajectory.
Yeah, just to add on at least a portion of the trade deal as it pertains to oil and gas and the $54 billion signed this year, because we haven't seen any parameters around how that's actually sketched out. So you can take, if you're talking about 20-year supply agreements, there's no color around discount rate, what you're actually capturing within that initial term. So we could be looking at 3 million tons of LNG sold this year over a 20-year basis that probably would have been in line with what they would have signed anyway. So it's really tough to look at that and think it's anything different than kind of a normal course of business. In fact, if you were to take a really strict look at it and say, okay, well, this is going to be a per annum figure, it actually wouldn't be doable based on what we're actually producing. So you're actually inclined to think of it as just this really grossed up number that doesn't really carry a lot of meaning with it.
So I know we have to wrap up, but there's certainly time for a question or two. Anybody has anything out here? Otherwise, we'll jump right to the ship owners panel. All right, I think we're out of time. So thank you very much for your discussion.